Welcome, everybody. My name is Karim Bardeesy. I'm the Executive Director of the Dais, a Leadership and Policy Institute here at Toronto Metropolitan University. And we're thrilled to welcome you for our fourth Dais talk on anti-racism, anti-Black racism online, supported by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Before we begin, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. This is a symbolic restorative act, one of many at Toronto Metropolitan University, which took the historic step of renaming itself as part of its reconciliation journey. We're here on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations' treaties and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. We look forward to our final Dais talk on anti-racism, focused on Indigenous reconciliation with the resource economy, coming up in a couple weeks. We also acknowledge and pay tribute to those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent who continue with the impacts of colonization in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. I'm pleased to report this series has been designed by our staff team. Kamara Chambers, our Director of Leadership Development, Rahel Apiachi David, who's joining us online, Tiana Thompson, and the rest of the Dais team is here, Tanya Coyle, Catherine and Bertie, Michelle Park, and Febin is maybe outside, and Christina Kisson, our teaching assistant of this class. Those of you who are joining in person or online, we're also joined by the students of Making the Future, SSH 505, an upper liberal class here at Toronto Metropolitan University, which I co-teach with Matthew Mendelsohn. Before we start, just some housekeeping reminders. So for those of you online, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A. Those in person can raise your hand, and I will get some in-person questions. I'll take them here. And for the online questions, I will quickly get out my computer at some point and have them sent to me over Slack. We want to prioritize as many questions as possible. We may not be able to get to them all because if we lose this room, as students in the room know, at 1 p.m. for the turnover of classes. Many things in the world are unreliable. The turnover of classes on the hour at TMU is not one of those unreliable things. Before we start, I wanted to share. So we'll take your questions that way. I think different among us have different experiences experiencing hate online and different experiences of anti-Black racism, whether it's something that is lived, something that we observe and fail to call out, something that we're trying to learn more about. I know in my own journey, it began many years ago in a town that had literally one Black family, and becoming friends with that family and hearing about the experiences that they had. And knowing that the lack of knowledge, lack of information, lack of contact and context can be really virulent. We're going to hear, I think, from both speakers today, the importance of education and the importance of commitment to doing the work of anti-racism more generally as it relates to this policy issue and as it relates to the online experience of anti-Black racism, particularly in Canada. I'll just introduce by the way, those in the room, there are refreshments on the side and maybe food refreshments, Dr. The food refreshments are coming. Want to introduce our speakers first online. Dr. Laura May Lindo. There is Dr. Lindo up there in the top right-hand corner, and you see her on the slide there. She's an activist and educator who holds a master's and PhD in education. Committed to centering the most vulnerable in all that she does. Her work is enhanced by her acute knowledge of how to put anti-oppression theories into practice. She is a politician, until recently a member of the Provincial Parliament for Kitchener Centre, and now assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Waterloo. Also connected to the Eraser Institute, and a new book on pedagogy and anti-racism is coming out soon. Welcome, Laura May. And in person, I have Jessica Yamoah, has a history of community engagement, entrepreneurial spirit, and the intersections of her experiences as a woman, a second-generation Canadian rather, team member of leading global organizations, including Nike, Nokia, and Apple. Anyone here heard of those brands or companies? and as a leader of emerging startups have all been a lead up to her founding INNOVATE Inc., which provides awareness and access through business entrepreneurship and innovation to create inclusive prosperity. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you.
And for those the students in the class, we've had a number of guest speakers in this class. What we actually haven't had we haven't had people who are on the front lines of entrepreneurship, and we've had a few people on the front lines of activism and politics, but none with the particular mix of interests that both of you have. So I'm really pleased to have you both here today. Maybe we'll just start. We'll go to questions for about. I'll do questions for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience and online, and we'll have a wrap at 1. Maybe I'll start with Jessica, and then we'll go online to you, Laura May, in a moment. Can you just share some sense of the state of anti-Black racism as you experience it, as you're aware of it, both in person and in online communities, and just where this issue is at
Sure.
from your perspective right now?
Absolutely. So just a heads up, as you know, I work in technology, so all my notes are on my phone, so I'm not texting or on Instagram. I'm literally just referencing my notes. That said, to give a little context around the state of anti-Black racism online, StatsCan actually did a report for 2022, and it measured, actually, let me take a step back. This class is very diverse, so depending on what your ethnic background is, or if you're first, second, third generation Canadian or deeper, how many of you would say that your upbringing or differs from that of your parents in terms of growing up here or living here versus living somewhere else and back home? How many of you would say your parents are tech savvy? Okay, there's 1, 2, maybe. How many of you guys can relate to the immigrant theory of, go to school, which is why you're all here, become a doctor, teacher, lawyer, engineer, all of those things? Okay. And how many of you have been told to, don't cause any trouble, get a good job, keep your head down, don't get involved in any of this activism stuff, all of the things. There you go. So imagine now you go online and you're getting bullied or you're facing any type of hatred or racism, that specifically in the Black community. The Black community experiences approximately 375 times more and hatred than any other community or group online. The difference is they don't report it. So 42.5% of the crimes are reported. That said, of those reported, it doesn't speak to how many are actually investigated or how many are actually pursued. So imagine, like you're saying, you're growing up and you have all these experiences. Your parents can't relate or don't relate, and you have very few people to go to. We did a campaign, and I'll just wrap it up really quickly, in 2018 called Violence 360, where we featured a young woman, second generation Canadian, actually first generation Canadian. She's a first generation born here. And she faced a sexual assault that was then continued through online bullying and online hate. She did not report it. And when she did try to report it, she was told by the police to just, don't want to ruin these boys' lives, all of these things. So that's just like a real life example of how that's happened or how it's played out. But you really get an idea of how things happen in real life and how they don't translate online, even though the effects and the results are ongoing.
Thank you so much. Laura May, same question. What are you seeing about the issue as it plays out online? I wouldn't mind at some point soon getting to your, you had a specific experience as a policymaker, if you don't mind talking about your attempts to address related issues and some of the backlash you experienced.
Absolutely. Thank you for that starting point, grounding us in stats, right? Because I think one of the things that we do see with anti-Black racism in particular is that when Black community members say they are experiencing it, we are told that it is not actually racism. And a number of excuses as to why we are having the experiences that we are having are presented to us. And so when I saw the question, I also did another search. There are so many reports about anti-Black racism that have happened in various community organizations that are quite sector specific. So for instance, most recently, I found this report from the NIA Center, which is an art center in Toronto. They were working on a report. I haven't seen the final report, but they were doing a call out to try and get some of that information about what's happening online, in particular, with Black community members experiencing hate. But what I also found fascinating is if you do a quick Google search about anti-Black racism online, you will find that report, and you'll also find out that the Senate committee is currently looking at anti-Black racism in the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So our Human Rights Commission has been found to be participating in anti-Blackness when it comes to the employees that are there. But that's the place that we go when we are experiencing hate. At the same time, Black community members, federal employees also have a Black action lawsuit against the federal government for the same thing. The reason I'm raising that, which is not particularly online hate, and is more like in-person, your work experiences, is that you can't actually separate them. Nobody would feel justified in leveling the kind of hate that they do against Black community members who are trying to address anti-Black racism unless they felt that those folks didn't belong in places. And so my particular example, when I was a member of provincial parliament, I tabled a piece of legislation called the Racial Equity in the Education Systems Act. It was Bill 67 in its first iteration, and it got retabled the next session as Bill 16. And while I was the anti-racism critic, which means this is right along the lines of what I should be doing as a policymaker, the minute I tried to make it real with actual policy change is when the hate arose. Up until then, I was doing a lot of my work and nobody was bugging me. But the minute I tabled that legislation, all of a sudden I was a Black woman just doing things for Black people. And that was going online. And as a public official, it was very easy to find me. And so you can still scroll. Some of my team was like, oh, we should hide it. I said, no, keep it up. Let people know what they're working with, because I think it's important for us to have a good sense of not just that anti-Black racism happens to Black folks online, but what it looks like, how horrible it can be, and the kinds of experiences that we have. I can speak more about that later, but I can at least leave it there to get you started.
Thanks, and we'll definitely come back to that experience. What are the things that affect the prevalence of this online or in person? Are there events? Are there, obviously the way social media platforms are governed can have a big determination if they turn certain spigots on and off. But what else? What do you see as the things that are determinative, and how in-person behavior affects online behavior?
Do you want to start with myself?
Sure.
Or...
Yeah, Jessica. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So coming from a tech background, I would say a lot of the I guess influences are the design of tech itself. A lot of you guys are very involved. You're all here for the exact same reason in terms of education and understanding like systemic anti-Black racism. So when the entire world is designed on system, social media or technology is a replication or a virtual replication of a system, you'll see the exact same things happening. So it's interesting that, for example, how many of you guys turned into either Instagram or X, as it's known, and couldn't see any more Canadian content in terms of news media? So there you go. When it comes to things that seem to be a priority for our government, certain things are pushed, they're able to do that. Or even the most basic example of, have you ever seen an episode of Oprah online anywhere? You've seen an episode of Oprah, the actual show? Okay, so some of her specials, yes, but she used to have a TV show that ran every day. Long story short, somehow, some way, she's one of the few people or one of the few pieces of content you cannot find online anywhere in terms of her TV show, like as a series, unless you buy her package, like you subscribe to it online. But yeah, when it comes to online hate, there's never a way to stop it or to block it. So again, it's structural in terms of the way it's designed, as well as social media being the wild, wild west where, for the most part, we can all contribute to it. When it's media, there's certain guidelines you have to follow. Working at Apple, working at Nike, you can't make claims about products unless they're verified and they're true. When it comes to social media, you can put anything in and the vocal minority endorses you or co-signs, and it becomes the reality. So I think it's a lot of the garbage in, garbage out, and just the design of social media itself replicating a virtual version of real life.
Gormit?
Jessica's on fire. Yeah. So the only thing I would add is it's something that we often say, but I think it's important for us to put on record. The anonymity of social media makes this so simple for a lot of people who are exploring race and trying to understand it. And so sometimes, even when it comes to the type of hate that you receive, it's like there's gradations. There's some people that will just say things that you think are questionable. You know, I would argue go back to where you came from. When I'm from Scarborough is a hilarious way to address me, right? But then there are people that will go as far as to use the N-word online. So there's the anonymity that allows people to try things out to see what will happen. And there's a comfort in not being known because they can make any kind of picture, they can decide how, like which platform they're going to use, all of that stuff. But the flip side, we often don't talk about as well, which is the organizing around white supremacy that allows that too. So at the same time that there's individuals that are making use of these platforms because of the anonymity to spread hate, there's also collective people, groups that organize around white supremacy that actually teach very anti-Black things to people and then help them to mobilize. So one of the other ways that I've seen anti-Blackness appear more recently is around things like spreading information about rallies that are going to happen, or let's go to school boards, this is happening right now, and challenge diversity training at the school board level. While the school board meetings are happening in person right now, the recruitment of speakers to go to those meetings and say things that are anti-Black is actually happening online. That's how people are connecting across jurisdictions to make sure that there's a bigger impact or bang for their buck when it comes to what's happening at those meetings. And so I think it's really, really important for us to remember that, yes, there is a distinction between what happens online and what happens in person, but they are not disconnected. When it comes to how hate is created and spread, we make use of both. And I think if we want to try and find policy approaches to address it, then we've got to also address both.
And that's really helpful. Thank you for reminding us that white nationalism online is effectively case by case, almost to a case, is effectively also anti-Black racism online. So I think that's a really important reminder. I want to get to some policy questions in a second, but first, maybe to speak from maybe can you help us speak a bit to the perspective of Black cultures and Black activism and Black presence online? There's been a very rich use of some of these platforms in very exciting ways and very interesting ways. Can you just speak to, and we hadn't talked about this question, so I apologize. Can you speak to that tradition of Black creators bringing their voices and bringing their anti-racist perspectives into these platforms as much as they're being subject to them?
Sure. So have any of you guys watched The Great Hack? No one? Okay. So really quickly, sorry. I'll make it quick. Long story short, it's on Netflix, and it's a documentary about Cambridge Analytica and how they use technology and social media to influence voting. And so when you're talking about mobilizing groups, there's a really strong example or case study on how Cambridge Analytica influenced voting in Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago leads into your question, is for the most part, the ethnic composition is Indo, so of Indian descent, and then Afro, so of African Caribbean descent. And so what happened was, it was election time, and they used social media to create campaigns where on one side, they pooled the Afro-Caribbean side to say, you know, join this movement. We're not against government, but we're against voting and all of those things to dissuade the Afro-Caribbean youth from voting, because they saw what happened with Obama and mobilizing to vote and whatnot. On the Indo side, and they became like music focused and created dances and just totally detracted from, and I'm giving a full note version, from voting. On the Indo-Caribbean side, what they did was, because they found the Indo-Caribbean side was more likely to follow rules and follow what their parents did and whatnot, encourage them to vote. And as a result, it influenced the way that the voting happened, and an Indo-Caribbean prime minister was voted in. So it's interesting, like you're saying, in terms of movement, like it talks about Russia and how Russia incites, uses the Black Lives Matter movement to incite, adversarial politics within the US. It just talks about a lot of things that, to your point, how you're able to use online social media to mobilize groups in positive or negative ways. And those are like some of the stronger examples. And then really quickly, I've had the opportunity to meet and spend some time with one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, just to understand that movement. So even seeing how that groundswell of free Black women came to be what it is, and how it like surged during the pandemic when no one could go anywhere or do anything but be online. So those are the two examples, and they probably some great ones.
Yeah, Laura May?
Oh, I'm going to go to the unprofessional side of Dr. Lindo. I'm going to talk. So one of the things that is very interesting, if you study pop culture, there's a lot of research that talks about Black communities in particular as huge drivers of pop culture. And so when new technology arises, there's often pockets of Black folks around the globe who are making use of it in unique ways. And so whatever the platform is, you will be able to find a Black creator, an artist of some kind, who is making fun of these systems on so many different levels and challenging us to think differently. So I think of simple things like the amount of, when I was at Queen's Park, I would sit at Queen's Park and ludicrous things would happen on all sides of the house. This is not a partisan statement. This is just a reality of being in that chamber. And there were moments where, because I am on camera in those moments, my facial expression was not one that I would be able to fully express how I felt. So instead, I would sit at my desk with my phone and I would put out print skips of all of the things that I thought were hilarious. And so use of like audio and video in little baby snippets to express how Black folks are feeling in a moment is sometimes more powerful to explain what the impact is of anti-Blackness than to actually sit down and have like, a 3-hour talk and we're going to discuss the theory and whatever. When you see that picture, there's this one picture of a Black woman who is like doing this. She's looking for something. People will make use of that image for things like looking for reconciliation. And then you just see this woman. But that kind of like, we laugh about it, but there's power in that, because I don't have to explain to you the right side of history. When you see that, you know it. Then you spend your time trying to explain why you don't believe the thing that you just felt. To me, that's the power of creatives making use of that online space in very unique ways. The flip, and I'll very quickly, is something that my sister actually introduced me to. It's this comedian, his name is White Yardie. I don't know if you've seen him, but White Yardie is a white Jamaican. Now, a lot of my parents are from Jamaica. So a lot of people don't realize that in Jamaica, there are white folks who don't necessarily identify as white. I have white, you would perceive them to be white if they were in Canada, but they claim Blackness because of their history, because Blackness is a political statement. It's not the color of my skin. And so White Yardie will literally just sit there speaking in like perfect patois, because that's where he's from, and he's just commenting on stuff. But in his doing that, he's actually challenging us to think differently about race. And so again, sometimes it's like that misdirection in comedy, where I do this for you using this kind of art so that you can think really deeply about something over there, but I'm not the one to say those words. I'm not telling you to think differently about race or address racism or become part of a movement. I'm just showing you the logical conclusion of some very silly things that we as humanity think.
Well, it's an interesting challenge to us at the Dais. When we designed this anti-racism series, we were using the platforms that are available to us. Maybe next time we should try Instagram Live, which allows emojis. Sorry, this is a Sometimes the ideas come out and like the execution is the difficult part. So in a university context, we're using a fairly familiar platform that isn't as participatory because frankly, and this was something as we were doing this series, we had talks on both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia just before and after the recent escalation in that long time conflict, and we were concerned about the way people would engage with that. So, but some of those participatory platforms, I guess, Laura May, you're like the emojis don't show up or the GIFs don't show up in Hansard, right? Like when you, which is the official record of the legislature, right? Like
they don't show up, and you're not really supposed to be like, I'm not recommending to any of you that want to become politicians to go do that. However, sometimes when you're trying to speak about racism, when there's so much resistance in the world, you have to do something that helps somebody to feel before you can talk.
Yeah.
And every platform provides you with a different opportunity to feel and explore a topic in a different way. So what I do on Twitter, I still call it Twitter, because when I think of X, I think of Malcolm X, and I just don't want to associate the two. So when I'm on Twitter, I have a different audience and a different approach. When I'm on Insta, I have a different audience and a different approach. When it's Facebook, so all of that makes a difference. And again, going back to Black community members, I feel like there is a creative way in which we make use of these different platforms to demonstrate our humanity. Not even like to perform it for you, but to be able to navigate the realities of what the world is throwing at us when it comes to anti-Blackness.
Last question before we go to the audience and online questions around policy solutions. So thank you so much for both of you for building that bridge to the lived experience that might be quite removed from policy in some cases. But now let's get to the policy solutions. Jessica, you started with some pretty numbing statistics about the scale of the problem and the scale of underreporting of hateful content online. Where are you at in the policy conversation? We've talked a bit about social media platforms. That's a complex issue, obviously. Where are you on some of the policy ideas that you have or that you're hearing from the community and from some of the people you consult with around what they think policymakers could do?
So I'll leave the political side to Dr. Lindo. But from a social or community standpoint, my experience has been, especially coming from the tech world as well as social and community, that there's a large need and a little bit of academic for interdisciplinary and intersectional, as we would call them in like the business world, cross-functional teams. So I think Dr. Laura Lindo, and there's now a surge of people who have different lived experience, who haven't been groomed their entire lives to be politicians, who have lived experience, who have done other things that, for example, like her, can bring to the table. So she understands what she's doing in terms of she's a woman of color, she's an academic, she's a mother, like all of these things that you can bring into this role that you're fulfilling. And she has links to community, right? It wasn't just I'm running a campaign, so now all of a sudden I'm going to start reaching out and get my name known. And I think that's where, as we vote and as people like yourselves decide what you want to do post-university, these are opportunities where people like you will be informing policy, or even as simple as your vote, making sure that your voice is heard, like knowing who your MPs and your MPPs are and doing that. Because as we saw during the pandemic, it started out with, Black Lives Matter and anti-Black hate, but then it evolved into like Asian hate and all of these things. And it's like, even though it doesn't affect you in the moment, you don't know what's going to happen after. Like in terms of, if you fall, Dr. Luther King, and I'm totally butchering it, but if you don't stand for anything, you fall for everything. So understanding and having that humanity that Dr. Lindo was speaking about earlier for each other, because I think that's what's missing very much so online, and that if we bring that back, that'll help in terms of creating policy.
Yeah.
And I'll jump in. So we actually have quite a lot of legislation and policy that is meant to address anti-Black racism. And I feel sometimes like what we don't have is the political will to actually mobilize it. So while we're having our discussion around what kinds of policy solutions can we propose when it comes to online hate and anti-Blackness online in particular, we in Ontario have an Anti-Racism Act. That act was passed in what, 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. Nobody talks about it. So nobody mobilizes with it. Nobody looks at it. And if you do look at it, which I did when I was tabling Bill 67 and then later Bill 16, that same racial equity bill in education, it doesn't define racism. It doesn't even say the words that are needed for community to be able to mobilize it as a tool to address racism, whether it's online or offline. Now, sometimes in policy, that quiet space is where magic can happen, but oftentimes the quiet space in policy is where nothing happens, where it just silences everything and the world continues. And what I do find is that when it comes to policy that is created to address racism, and while I'm going to focus on anti-Blackness, but I pretty much guarantee this is the same for any type of racism, and all racism is different. How it appears looks different for different people, etc. But oftentimes it's lacking in rigor. And so I will spend all sorts of time developing policy around housing initiatives, healthcare initiatives. I'll make sure that there's public reporting that has to be done. I'll ask for particular things in the public reporting that happens. But with racism, it's like, okay, here's an anti-racism act in Ontario. Now you can go forth and hug it out, because that's like pretty much all you can do, right? And so there is a mechanism inside the bill that says there should be public reporting, and they put something online. But the stuff that goes online for that report, and this is policy, the stuff that goes online to address that report is often, doesn't really matter what government it is, just saying the government is doing enough. Like, as opposed to recognizing how monetary investments in particular things are changing something or not. So the last thing that I just want to make sure I don't forget to say out loud is another policy. So there's a Black Youth Action Plan, for instance. This is Black community members have fought to have money that is directed towards Black youth who are often overrepresented in the criminal justice system, pushed out of school so they don't have access to higher paying jobs. They're not provided with the same kind of support system that they need to thrive. So the Black Youth Action Plan was something that Black community members advocated for and received. When the government is actually putting the money towards the plan, I found out that while they do request that anybody who receives some of that funding for a project, for instance, does a final report, the government doesn't collect data on the reports or on what happens next, which means that the money goes to a project, but that project isn't sort of looked at to see if it's actually addressed the problem so that they can figure out and be strategic with where the money goes next. So if you have policy that doesn't actually bring you to a space where it makes real change, where there's a plan and a strategy, then I have questions about whether or not we need more policy or we need more political will to actually make the change on the ground.
And as someone who is the director of policy in the government, where we renewed the Youth Action Plan, maybe just two comments on what happened there. One, the interest in these issues, unfortunately, from a government perspective, and this was before the creation of the Anti-Racism Directorate, is often proportionate to, well, specifically that plan. The interest in it within public service and within some quarters of government was highly proportional to the state of gun violence. I don't know if, and the state of political interest was highly proportional to the state of gun violence, which is not a good not a good place to be in, where that's the thing that you're turning to in reaction. The second point, I think is very familiar to students in this class, is governments, the apparatus of government is much better at policymaking and at program construction, program delivery gets a bit harder, and then program review and outcomes, that's often an afterthought. And so that's a really good reminder, Dr. Lindo. And sometimes we need some of the best and more purposeful results of policy. And the most purposeful, rather, review of policy comes from, frankly, Auditor General reports and reports by people who are outside of working for Parliament or working outside rather than in government. So thank you for those remarks. Just wanted to get to some audience questions, and I'll start with some from online. This is a spicy one. What is the worst social media platform for anti-racism? So there's probably a measurable view of this. I suspect, and this is a highly variable depending on this can change fast, as we know. But do either of you want to take that on? And if those folks on those platforms are watching, well, we hope they are.
I can tell you which one I think has been the hardest to navigate. It's actually been Twitter, X. And part of why I think is because you're limited with characters, which means you can't explain anything in any particular way. And so then people who don't actually want to engage in a real conversation about anything, because that's not really what that platform was created for, will either go on the defensive or attack you for whatever with a whole bunch of assumptions. And it's very easy to mobilize a whole bunch of other people around you on that particular platform that make it problematic. But wherever there's a problem is also your solution. The flip side of it is that you can become very talented in being very clear and very direct about what it is that is racist and why. And then you can go and like eat ice cream while the world goes on fire because of something that you tweeted. I've done that before too.
That's good.
I think they're all equally they're all equal in the sense that, to your point, and I think you brought up a great point, Dr. Lindo, in terms of the different formats. Like Twitter used to be mostly text, whereas Instagram is more visual. And sometimes you don't need to say anything, but an image says 1,000 words. So by the time you put an image, you put some music behind it. If the music is misogynistic and all of those other things, you can have just as much an effect. There's actually a report out of the US, their health department, on the effects of online and social media of anti-Black racism. And so it's interesting how they spoke to the effects personally and professionally. So it also had an economic root as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then just really quickly to what you were saying around, what Dr. Lindo was saying around solutions, and then what you were saying, it's a weird full circle, because I was one of the recipients, or not I, but my organization was one of the recipients of the Black Youth Action Plan. And our campaign, or one of our project, won because we did leverage social media to combat and to prevent violence amongst Black youth. So we used YouTube as our medium, and we were able to, without saying a lot of things, use imagery to tell stories that, for example, the one woman that we focused, it was close to the time around the Me Too movement. So people weren't necessarily only looking at her as a Black woman, they were just looking at her as a woman who had experienced a sexual assault. Being able to tell those youth stories in things that, like with the producers who were of the community, so they were making sure they're told the best light and best stories, like, was important. So that kind of ties back into like.
Okay, and maybe we can share that with all those who register on Eventbrite after this session, and some of the other resources that have been mentioned. Before I get off social media, most improved award. Do any of them deserve a most improved award on fighting racism on their platforms?
I think it's the community that deserves the award. Yeah, we're the ones that are making use of the platform in a way different than what is expected and finding ways around the hate as it arises. So I say give that award to the people.
Awesome. Okay, and we have that's a call to action to those of you online and in person as well. And I'm ready to take in-person questions as well. Just put your hands up. Another online question. Can you talk about the state of anti-racism education in particular for educators or human resources people, or the people who in turn are connecting with people that they have responsibility for. And Dr. Lindo, I think some of your private members will had a bit to do with this. So could each of you speak to that, the state of it?
You want to start? in terms
No,
of-
you start. I'll jump in after.
Okay, so I would say in terms of like people who are responsible for communities, that like the government just enacted from a business perspective, the 50-30. It's a challenge, but it's a law where organizations or businesses are required to have 50% gender representation and 30% ethnic or whatnot, ethnic, religious, etc. I guess GD plus catch-all responsibilities or representation. So there's work that's being done, but I think again, it's pretty performative in terms of checking boxes versus looking at the systemic issues and really doing the work to have more people engaged. So instead of it being dominant culture men, now you're having dominant culture women, or it becomes this like hierarchy of who's more oppressed or who's yelling the loudest or who economically do they have the most or least to gain from. So I think it's just more so, again, hiring more people that have the lived experience that can really do the work, but also to Dr. Lindo's point, having the longitudinal studies that we lack, and hopefully some of you guys will take on in master's and PhD work.
I would just add that, again, going back to some thoughts around policy to answer that too. So in education, from kindergarten to grade 12, we have an Education Act. That act is 300 and some odd pages. And in it, it tasks everybody at every level of education to create inclusion in their space. So whether you're an administrator, you create an inclusive school. If you're a teacher, inclusive classrooms. If you're a student, you should be striving to be more inclusive. But in the act, it never talks about racism. And in the act, it never talks about the tools that are needed to create inclusive spaces. And so I'm of the opinion that, again, when we create any kind of legislation and then the consequent policies that are supposed to support that legislation or regulations that are supposed to support this sort of doing of the legislation on the ground, if we don't define our terms and if we don't speak explicitly about what it is that we're trying to create and imagine in a real way, we're never going to get anywhere. And so Bill 67 was meant to do that, to give tools to educators so that they could do that work. And when I say educators, it wasn't even just K to 12, it was early childhood educators so that they had the knowledge that they needed to be able to address racism in tangible ways. And then if you're in teachers college, so university students, you would have access to the tools that you needed. If you were on a board for a school board, etc., you would have access to the training that you needed. But as soon as that was tabled, it was taken up as an example of critical race theory infiltrating Ontario. I was targeted by some folks who loved me and made videos, including.
Sorry, can I just pause this? I mean, including, and we shared this with the students in the class, including someone with 7.5 million YouTube followers, Jordan B.
Oh,
Peter.
Yeah. He
What was
made a
that
number of videos, which launched a whole slew of hate, like hate that none of us could have imagined. And I had to shut my office down because of the level of hate that we were getting both online and via email. People were looking for me. There were these little communities where they were trying to put together from various things that I had said in articles over the years, where my kids went to school, how many kids I had, what grades they were probably in, where they might be located. I had to go to the police because of the amount of attacks that we were getting online. My staff was scared. Like it was literally, truly a hot mess. And all we were trying to do was to put the tools in place for you to do what legislation asked. And I raise that because the hate doesn't come at the same level when we're just speaking about stuff. The hate usually transforms into like a multitude of rancor when we're demanding change, when we put a solution forward. So when you're at that precipice of actual change, that's when the haters start to come out and say, status quo is what we're here for. And so online, it has made it easier for people to be able to do that. It's made it easier for people to remind folks about what's happening. It's made it easier for them to make up stories around why you're doing stuff. And just for the record, the Bill 67 and Bill 16, yes, that is an example of critical race theory. There were some people online who were like, oh my gosh, you're not even calling it critical race theory, but you're trying to dupe everybody into believing it. Critical race theory is just putting race central in the way that you're doing your work. And I was. And so I was like, yeah, that is exactly what I'm doing. That's how you make change in a world where the last segregated school in Ontario closed in 64 or something ridiculous like that. 1964. Like, we know people that were around in 1964 and so if that's the nature of education on this land, stolen land from Indigenous communities that we also don't want to talk about, then when we try and do the work to make the change, that's when you start to see people concerned about what this shift is going to mean. Sorry, that was a bit ranty.
No, it's good. Catherine.
Do you think more young people going to tech and working in companies would help? And is tech culture anti-Black? So just to give you context, and
Can I read this question?
Sure.
Question was, the last part of the question was, is tech culture anti-Black, which is a mind-focusing question, and the rest of the question was around the inclusion practices in the tech sector more generally, and whether those are making progress by and large.
So 50/30 challenge applies to all publicly, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so don't quote me 100%, but it's not only tech, it's all publicly traded or public companies. So it's a federal rule, and so, or federal law, or part of the laws that are put out. And so that applies to all of them. In terms of tech, I think tech is structurally or systemically biased in terms of it's very much based on who's programming and setting the information. So if you have red M&Ms programming tech, you're going to have all the outputs and all the outcomes based on red M&Ms and their experiences. So systemically and structurally, I would say there's definitely anti-Black racism built into it. And I think the only way to change that is like bringing in more people from diverse backgrounds. And I think even when Dr. Lindo was speaking around her experiences as an MPP, also recognizing the fact that one of her biggest supporters and fans was a man, and the fact that women receive that, or from a gender perspective, even worse when you bring in intersections of religion, gender, race, ethnicity, all of those things, and that again replicates in business, but especially in technology, because as you know, technology, knowledge, all of those industries are what are going to drive our GDP and our economy forward. So if we don't start thinking about those things, and as we're building our society and building this whole tech space, and not everything, it's not just like, hey, I'm a coder. This is how you bank, how you get a loan, how your credit score is done. Even now that they're doing all the facial recognition and all of that, how, I mean, I'm sure most of you have seen it. I don't remember if it was Google, but basically they recognize like a monkey or gorilla as a Black person. So all of those things, if those are what's being programmed, then what do you think the outcomes are going to be? And those could be easily changed if you have a woman who's like, hey, why is this not referenced or thought of, or someone from a certain culture? And then the last thing, Dr. Lindo called out the fact that people would antagonize her about being pro-Black, and it's like, but you would never say something about another culture to say, well, why do we have an Indigenous person leading the Indigenous group? Because they're the authorities and the experts in that community, in that space. So seeing it as a value add and seeing what they bring to the table versus it being something that's persecuted, because we all benefit from it. If you look at people with varying physical abilities, as much ramps are there primarily for wheelchairs and whatnot. The minute you have a suitcase, the minute you have a child and you have to push them in a stroller, that benefits everybody. So if we start thinking about racism and all of those things in ways, or finding the solutions to her point in ways that benefit us all, then I think we'll be able to move society forward.
One more maybe rapid fire question. Please comment on the use of social media to combat and highlight the prominence of police brutality against Black people. So make this more of the hopeful or the propositional use of social media for policy change.
So for me, the benefit of social media is being able to expand my reach when it comes to organizing. And so to address and combat, or even recognize police brutality in Ontario, let's be specific, because that's where these policies and the laws are happening when it comes to our criminal courts here. It's really, really important for us to make use of all of these platforms as a way of helping to connect the dots. So one of the things that often happens when it comes to anti-Blackness is that I have an experience, whether it's we'll keep it in policing, but it could be literally any sector. I have an experience. I say this experience is racism. You know, I was followed and the police pulled me over. They were pretty aggressive with me, whatever. The minute I explain my experience, it's like the world around is trying to make this only an individual experience about an individual officer. And what we have to do on the flip side to organize in anti-racist ways is to connect the dots and let folks know that my experience of that happening is exactly like the young woman in Cambridge who was followed home in the middle of the night. And the police claimed that they thought that she fit the description of, and I'm pretty sure it was a Black male that they were looking for. And that is connected to this experience, is connected to this experience. And those dots that you connect, that's actually how the Human Rights Commission determines that anti-Black racism was embedded in a system. So for us to be able to address the over-policing of Black and Indigenous people in Ontario, we have to actively share these examples of racism to demonstrate the pattern. And so social media becomes a wonderful place for us to share that. I think also, last thing, because I know we're being fast, it's also a place where if I experience anti-Blackness, and I'm not getting support through the systems that are supposed to help me. When I go online, hearing other people who say, it happened to me too, keep fighting, we hear you, we see you, we're holding you, it can become part of my healing. And so for me, the online space, yes, it can be horrid, but it can also be extremely hopeful because of how many more people I can reach in that space compared to if I was just sitting at home with my own experience.
Just agree. And I think that social media democratizes the way media portrays things. So before it'd be media and it's all controlled by, you know, the major media stakeholders, but now we all have an opportunity to contribute to that. So
Laura May, Lindo, Jessica Yamoah, thank you so much for joining the Dais today. All our Dais talks are free. The next one coming up is on Monday, November 6th at 4:30 at our offices at 20 Dundas Street West, how generative AI will impact democracy. That's with our Dais senior fellow, Sam Jeffers. Our next and last Dais talk on anti-racism it's coming up on Tuesday, November 14th at 6 p.m. At our office and online, environmental racism, Indigenous communities. Thank you so much to the Dais team, to our guests. And for those of you joining online, thank you for joining us. If you're in person, we have some Jamaican patties and refreshments. And if you're in the class, one last point question. If you're in the class, who's coming to the Marshall Gans session? Some hands are up. There's one last chance. If you would like to come to the Marshall Gans session, Michelle is going to, there's on D2L, there's a 2-question quiz, which may be familiar because it's the questions you may have seen before. Go to D2L, do the 2-question quiz. And if you succeed at that 2-question quiz, we will be inviting you to join us for Marshall Gans at Massey College at 3:15. So again, that session is at 3:15 today. And thanks to both of you.